When Ed Gein died in a mental hospital in 1984, decades of horror were already buried with him, and with them, the tortured ghost of a man shaped by isolation, fear, and a mother's extreme control. Edward Theodore. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, the younger of two sons to George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine, née Lerck. His older brother Henry was about 5 years older. From early on, their household was far from normal. His mother, Augusta, was devoutly religious, fanatically so. Each afternoon she gathered her boys to read from the Bible, often choosing grim passages from the Old Testament or the Book of Revelation. She preached strict moral codes, repeatedly condemning the sins of the world, warning against alcohol, and painting all women except herself as inherently immoral, as temptresses and instruments of evil. Outside school, Ed's world was largely the family farm, a remote, isolated place near Plainfield, Wisconsin, which the family moved to sometime around 1915. His father, George, had worked as a carpenter, tanner, and local grocer, but in time he sold the business and relocated the family to a 155-acre farm. Life on that farm was lonely. Ed rarely ventured beyond the property except for school. His social interactions were minimal, tightly controlled by his mother. Augusta didn't allow her sons to make friends. Chores and farm work took up nearly all their time. Those who knew young Ed described him as shy, withdrawn, and socially awkward. Teachers and classmates recalled odd behaviors, random laughter, as if he was amused by a private joke no one else heard. He had a lazy eye, a slight physical trait that made him stand out and might have contributed to his social isolation. Meanwhile, his father's presence was volatile. George was reportedly an alcoholic, prone to bouts of violence and anger, especially toward his sons. That volatility further deepened Ed's retreat into himself, leaving him emotionally dependent on his mother, a dependence that would later twist into something far darker. The family's downward spiral accelerated over time. In 1940, Ed's father George died of heart failure at age 66. Then, in 1944, his older brother Henry died under mysterious circumstances during a fire near the family farm. Ed reported him missing and led police to the body, which bore bruises on the head, though the death was officially ruled accidental asphyxiation. With Henry gone, Ed was left with only his mother. Augusta herself suffered a stroke soon after Henry's death, and her health deteriorated rapidly. Ed became her caregiver in their isolated farmhouse, a home without modern plumbing or comforts. Then, in December 1945, she died at age 67. Her death hit Ed hard. He had lost his only close family member, the person he had turned to for emotional support. According to people who later interviewed him, Ed said she was his only friend, his one true love. After her death, he retreated even deeper into isolation. He shut off parts of the farmhouse and preserved them as a shrine to his mother. In many ways, Ed became a ghost living among relics of the past, a hermit with no purpose, no community, no real human connection. People around town remembered him mainly as the quiet handyman or the unassuming man who sometimes babysat for neighbors' children. But beneath that quiet exterior, something was slowly shifting, a psychological unraveling that no one could yet see. The seeds were there, the isolation, the obsessive attachment to a deceased mother, the lifetime of fearful lessons about sin and women, the lack of real human relationships, the shame and self-loathing, all of it germinating in secret. And then, on November 16, 1957, everything changed. When Bernice Worden opened her hardware store on the morning of November 16, 1957, she had no reason to believe it would be the last day of her life, no reason at all to sense the quiet man who stopped in earlier that week would be the key to a horror beyond imagination. That day begins like any other, routine, predictable, almost painfully ordinary, and it is that ordinariness that makes what follows so chilling, because nothing in the crisp November air hints at the darkness waiting just beneath the surface of Plainfield, Wisconsin. It is early morning, just after 8 a.m. in a few minutes, when Bernice unlocks the front door of Worden's Hardware and implements her usual ritual of sweeping, checking inventory, and going over the day's receipts. She is 58 years old, widowed, known in Plainfield as reliable, steady, and hardworking. The shop has been her livelihood for years, and she runs it with a sense of quiet pride. Locals see her as both tough and kind, a woman who keeps her business running even through Wisconsin winters that bite as hard as wolves. She glances at the ledger from the previous day. There is an entry written in her neat handwriting, listing a purchase request from a man she has known casually since childhood, a man named Ed Gein, who said he would be back that weekend to buy antifreeze. Around town, Ed is described as harmless. Strange, yes. Quiet, certainly, but never threatening. He works odd handyman jobs, helps neighbors repair fences or fix machinery, and offers venison during hunting season. Kids he babysits say he is gentle, friendly, almost childlike. Adults say he is peculiar but mild, someone you might ignore without a second thought. It is a small town, the kind where everyone thinks they know everyone else, the kind where it seems impossible for true evil to take root. That illusion will not survive the day. Shortly after 5 p.m. in a few minutes, Frank Worden, Bernice's son and the town's deputy sheriff, drives toward the store, expecting to find his mother preparing to close for the evening. Instead, he sees the lights off, the store locked, and something in his gut twists. He enters through the back, calling out for her, expecting an answer. There is none. Inside, the shop is chillingly still, and as his eyes adjust to the dimness, he notices the first wrong detail. The cash register is open, the drawer is empty, and then he sees it. Blood, a dark smear across the linoleum floor, forming a trail that drags toward the rear of the shop. Not a spill, not an accident, something violent, something deliberate. Frank steps into deputy mode instantly, though his hands shake. He calls the sheriff and reports what he's found. Word spreads fast, too fast, because Plainfield has fewer than 700 people, and every shockwave reaches the edge of town in minutes. Storefront doors open, neighbors step outside, and whispers ripple down Main Street. Someone is missing. Something terrible has happened. Investigators arrive quickly. They carefully examine the scene, noting a single receipt, the last one written that day, showing a sale of antifreeze to Ed Gein. That receipt, still sitting on the counter, is small, almost insignificant, but it becomes the first domino to fall. They also find that one of Worden's rifles is missing from the wall display. Blood appears to have pooled near the counter before being dragged away. By 6 p.m. and 30 minutes, suspicion is already circling around the quiet farmhand who lived on a remote property just outside town. Ed Gein's name isn't shouted, but everyone hears it whispered. Investigators try to keep things contained, but Plainfield residents watch from windows and porches, eyes wide with fear. As they question townspeople, details begin to surface. A witness recalls seeing Gein's truck near the store earlier that morning. Another remembers him mentioning that he needed antifreeze before winter really set in. Still another says that Gein had been acting stranger than usual lately, though no one can articulate what that means, not yet. Before heading to the farm, deputies decide to locate Gein in town. Around 7 p.m., they find him at a grocery store, behaving with the same quiet, gentle manner everyone knows. He does not resist the officers. He does not ask questions. He simply agrees to accompany them without complaint, almost as though he has been expecting this moment. While Gein is taken to the sheriff's office, another team heads to his farmhouse, a place no one else in Plainfield has visited in years. The property is a sprawling, decaying shell, surrounded by fields brittle with frost. The farmhouse windows are dark, the siding weathered and sagging. The front door hangs slightly crooked. The building radiates a sense of abandonment, a silent warning that whatever waits inside has been left to fester in isolation. Deputies approach cautiously, flashlights in hand, weapons drawn. The wind howls across the empty fields, scraping dead corn stalks against one another. The door groans as they force it open. Immediately they are hit with the smell, a sickening blend of rot, old dust, and something far more pungent, something unmistakably wrong. Their lights sweep across clutter, stacked newspapers, and debris. The kitchen looks like it has not been cleaned in years, with piles of junk and dishes left coated in grime. But this is only the threshold. One of the deputies moves toward the woodshed just outside the house, brushing aside hanging strips of burlap, shining his light into the cold darkness. And there, suspended from the rafters, he sees it. A human body, headless, gutted, strung up the way a hunter might dress a deer. It is Bernice Worden. For a few seconds, there is no sound except breathing, sharp and ragged. Even seasoned lawmen are not prepared for what they are seeing. The body is pale, frozen by the cold, handled with a grotesque kind of precision. The discovery triggers an immediate escalation. More officers are called in. Reporters begin to gather. Neighbors stand outside with lanterns and flashlights, praying for answers while bracing for the worst. Inside the farmhouse, investigators proceed carefully, methodically, not yet understanding that what they have stumbled into is more than murder, more than violence. It is madness sculpted into physical form. They move through the house, room by room, opening doors slowly, never sure what they will find behind each one. And with every new discovery, the horror deepens. Human bones arranged in piles, a chair upholstered with human skin, masks made from faces, skulls turned into bowls, objects fashioned from body parts so grotesque and surreal that investigators have to remind themselves repeatedly that they are real. Evidence of grave robbing appears everywhere. Remains too old to belong to Bernice Worden or Mary Hogan, the tavern keeper who vanished 3 years earlier. Tattered clothing, preserved body parts. The beginnings of something unspeakable, something Gein has been building in secret for years. But investigators do not yet comprehend the full scale. They do not yet know about the woman's suit, crafted from the skin of exhumed corpses. They do not yet know how many graves were disturbed, how many families were unknowingly entangled in this nightmare. They do not yet see the psychological abyss behind Gein's actions. All they know in this moment is that the crime scene is unlike anything they have ever encountered. A place where the boundary between life and death, sanity and delusion, has been erased completely. And just when they think they have reached the limits of horror inside that farmhouse, one deputy opens a door that was blocked by a cabinet. He pushes it aside, slowly, hesitantly, because something on the other side feels different. And then detectives find something that changes everything. And with that discovery, the true horror of Ed Gein's crimes began to reveal itself. But the worst was still waiting. When detectives opened that hidden door inside the farmhouse, they found themselves staring at a nightmare that defied belief. The surface clutter of old newspapers and garbage gave way, but behind it was evidence of something far darker than simple murder. They discovered dozens of human remains, bones, fragments, strange objects, skulls, skin, masks, furniture that had been altered in ways no sane person should ever do, chairs upholstered in human skin, lampshades made of face hides, bowls carved from skulls, and in a box, human skin, cut, tanned, preserved, artifice made from death. Investigators realized this was not a crime of passion or momentary rage. This was methodical, ritualistic, pathological. Perhaps most chilling of all, the corpse of the woman who triggered the investigation, Bernice Worden, found hanging upside down in the shed, her body dressed out like a deer carcass, head severed, torso gutted. As more rooms yielded horrors, the scope of what investigators were dealing with became clear. Gein did not just kill when he needed a corpse. He had for years robbed graves. Between 1947 and 1952, he admitted to as many as 40 nocturnal visits to local cemeteries, targeting freshly buried women whose bodies he believed resembled the one person he could never let go of, his dead mother. One of the state crime laboratory investigators later opened several test graves, identified by Gein. Empty coffins, missing bodies, or partial remains. In one case, no corpse remained. In another, the coffin held only a few bones and Gein's pry bar. In the last, much of the body was absent, though rings and other small items had been left behind. Confirmation that Gein's story about grave robbing was not delusion. Even then, investigators still didn't fully grasp the psychological weight of what they uncovered, that this was not mere morbidity, but possibly a delusional quest for identity. During interrogation, Gein would later admit that after his mother died, he began crafting what he called a woman's suit, a grotesque disguise made from human skin he believed could help him become his mother, or a facsimile of her. By the time the police realized what kind of monster they had captured, the farmhouse had become more than a crime scene. It was a physical embodiment of a fractured mind, a collection of grief, obsession, isolation, and horror. And just when Plainfield thought it had escaped the worst, the investigation was only beginning. What investigators didn't realize yet was that they were dealing with a classic case of a disorganized but deeply ritualistic offender, someone whose crimes were not about power or rage in the conventional sense, but about identity, delusion, and a desperate attempt to resurrect a world that no longer existed. As the farmhouse was secured, teams of deputies, state agents, and forensic specialists began the grim task of cataloging everything inside. It took hours just to establish walkable paths through the debris. The structure felt suffocating, every room heavy with decay and confinement, and yet every item found told investigators that Ed Gein had been living in this environment for years. He had been comfortable in it. He had created it. They started with the shed because that was where the most urgent evidence lay. Bernice Worden's body was carefully lowered and wrapped for transport to the coroner. The wounds on her body were precise, almost surgical, and that troubled the forensic team immediately. This was not clumsy violence. This was practiced. Whoever had done this had confidence and experience with cutting into human tissue. The deer dressing technique suggested a man who hunted regularly. The lack of hesitation marks suggested someone who wasn't improvising. And yet, despite the brutality, there was no attempt to hide the body. It hung in plain sight, as if Gein didn't consider discovery a real threat, or perhaps he believed no one would ever come looking. Inside the house, the discoveries multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. The kitchen table held human bones arranged in stacks. Containers of preserved organs sat beside cans of food. In one corner, a belt made of nipples was found coiled like a discarded snake. On the walls, investigators found masks that appeared to be made from human faces, some tanned, some dried, some stretched over molded forms. A lampshade crafted from skin hung near a cluttered workbench. Someone whispered that the house felt like a museum built by madness. Investigators moved slowly, methodically, taking photographs, labeling each object, sealing remains in bags. They wore masks, but still the smell seeped into their clothing, a sour reminder of what they were touching. One deputy stepped into the parlor and froze when he saw an object on the bed. It was a torso skin, hollowed and preserved with stitching marks along the sides. It lay there like a discarded garment. Nearby, a box contained female lips strung together on a cord like a grotesque necklace. These were not trophies in the way some killers kept them. These appeared functional, used, worn. That realization sent a chill through the room. In the center of the parlor, they found something investigators would refer to for years as the suit. A full-body arrangement of skin, carefully stitched together from various corpses, constructed to resemble a woman's body. It included breasts. It included details no sane mind would replicate. When investigators asked Gein later why he made it, he answered in a flat, emotionless tone that he wanted to become his mother, to crawl into her skin. The statement echoed through the minds of everyone who heard it, because it was not metaphorical, it was literal, and it aligned perfectly with what they found in the house. As night deepened, the farmhouse became a scene of non-stop activity. Floodlights illuminated the yard, while officers carried evidence from the house. People from Plainfield stood behind the police line, whispering, praying, crying, unable to comprehend that this had happened in their town, committed by a man they thought they knew. Some townspeople recalled that Gein often attended their children's school plays. Others remembered him fixing fences, shoveling driveways, helping out without being asked. And now, the same hands that repaired their property had committed horrors none of them were prepared to imagine. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Ed Gein sat calmly in an interrogation room. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not appear nervous. He did not seem confused or frightened. Instead, he He spoke in a slow, almost childlike way, as though describing memories of chores on the farm. When asked about Bernice Worden, he admitted that he had gone to the store that morning, but his account drifted into tangents. He spoke of needing antifreeze. He spoke of hearing voices sometimes. He mentioned his mother repeatedly. It became clear to the interrogators that they were speaking with someone who lived in a different psychological reality than the world around him. Eventually, when asked about Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who vanished 3 years earlier, Gein nodded and said quietly that he did something about her. Officers exchanged glances. They searched the kitchen, and there, in a paper bag near the stove, they found Mary Hogan's head. It was preserved, lips still recognizable. The shockwaves from that discovery rattled every officer in the building. As interrogators pressed further, Gein began to speak of graveyards, of moonlit nights when he felt compelled to visit the cemetery. He described exhuming recently buried women, explaining that he could tell which graves held bodies similar to his mother. He claimed he sometimes left without taking anything, that the urge would pass. Other times, he dug into the soil with a frenzy, breaking open coffins to retrieve parts he believed he needed. Forensic investigators later confirmed that the graves he identified were indeed disturbed, the coffins damaged, the bodies missing crucial portions. Psychologists were called in almost immediately. One psychiatrist described Gein's delusions as mother fixation in its most extreme form, with psychotic features and probable hallucinations. Gein spoke of feeling that his mother was still present, still watching, still judging. After her death, he turned her room into a shrine, sealing it off. That room, investigators discovered, was untouched by the filth and decay of the rest of the house. It was clean, preserved, perfectly maintained. Dust lay gently on surfaces, but nothing was disturbed. It was as though time had stopped there, frozen on the day she died. The contrast between that room and the rest of the house shocked even the most experienced officers. It was the physical manifestation of Gein's fractured psyche, worship on one side of the wall, madness on the other. But even with every discovery cataloged, investigators still did not know whether Gein had killed more people. Rumors spun through the town like wildfire. There were long missing hunters, a local teenager who vanished during babysitting, a child who disappeared in 1947. Investigators questioned Gein, asked directly whether he had taken other lives. Sometimes he said no. Sometimes he said he did not remember. Sometimes he simply stared, expressionless, as if the question itself had slipped past him. Polygraph tests suggested he was not lying about the others, but even that did not quiet public fear. Plainfield would never truly believe the nightmare was limited to just 2 victims. As evidence accumulated, prosecutors prepared their case, knowing it would be unlike anything Wisconsin had ever seen. Judges, attorneys, law enforcement all struggled with the sheer volume of macabre details. And yet, the legal questions were overshadowed by one central issue: Ed Gein's mind. Was he competent enough to stand trial? Did he understand the nature of his acts? Could he tell right from wrong? Psychiatrists debated, evaluated, tested, and the more they learned, the more they realized they were facing a man who had not simply committed crimes, but who had lived inside an alternate world built on grief, delusion, and obsession. And just when it seemed the investigation had uncovered every secret Ed Gein kept, one final psychological evaluation revealed something darker still, something that suggested his crimes were driven by a force far more disturbing than detectives had imagined. What the final psychiatric evaluation revealed was that Ed Gein did not simply suffer from delusions, he lived entirely inside them, wrapped in a world where death was fluid, identity was malleable, and the boundary between the living and the dead had eroded long before his crimes ever began. Psychologists concluded he was profoundly schizophrenic, experiencing auditory hallucinations, severe detachment from reality, and a fixation on his mother that shaped every decision he made. The official term used in their reports was psychotic break with severe distorted beliefs, but investigators who read those notes later described it in simpler terms: he was lost, completely and irretrievably lost. As the investigation shifted into courtroom preparation, prosecutors faced an unusual challenge. They had overwhelming physical evidence of Gein's crimes, but mental illness hovered like a shadow over every legal step. The question was no longer what he had done. The farmhouse proved that beyond doubt, but whether he understood the nature and wrongfulness of those actions. In late 1957 and early 1958, psychiatric experts examined him extensively. Gein explained, in his flat, gentle voice, that he believed he could reconnect with his mother by creating what he called a woman suit. He described how he shaped the mask pieces, how he stored them, how he selected body parts that resembled her. He spoke of graveyards as though they were markets to visit, not sacred resting places. He said he sometimes heard his mother's voice calling to him, guiding him, scolding him, telling him what he must do. His words were chilling not because they were angry, but because he said them with the calm confusion of someone explaining a dream. He said he didn't mean harm. He said he was lonely. He said he missed her. And while those statements did nothing to soften the horror of what he had done, they revealed the depth of his unraveling. By November of 1957, the state formally charged Ed Gein with the murder of Bernice Worden. The other murder, that of tavern owner Mary Hogan, was acknowledged but not immediately tried, because the evidence tied directly to Worden was stronger, more complete. As the legal process unfolded, people in Plainfield struggled to reconcile two images: the mild-mannered handyman they had known for decades, and the architect of a house filled with human remains. Parents kept their children indoors. Hunters stopped going into the woods alone. Women locked their doors at night, glancing over their shoulders even though Gein was already behind bars. The sense of safety that once defined Plainfield had vanished, replaced by a lingering dread that would remain for generations. In January of 1958, a judge declared Gein legally insane and unfit to stand trial. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a high-security psychiatric institution where he underwent further evaluation. Doctors noted that he cooperated willingly, answered questions politely, and exhibited no signs of aggression. He read magazines, he gardened, he helped with small chores. But even there, he existed in a detached fog, often drifting into private conversations with people no one else could hear. Years later, as his mental state stabilized under treatment, the courts revisited his competency. In 1968, more than a decade after his arrest, he was deemed mentally capable of understanding the court proceedings, and a trial was finally scheduled. It took only a few days. The testimony focused on the murder of Bernice Worden, describing the evidence found at his farm in plain, clinical terms, because the brutality itself needed no exaggeration. Gein sat quietly through the trial, showing no apparent emotion. When asked how he pleaded, he said, "Not guilty by reason of insanity," and the court agreed. He was returned to the hospital, this time indefinitely. But if the courtroom marked the legal end of the case, the psychological impact was far from over. Criminal psychologists dissected the details for years, calling Gein's behavior an extreme manifestation of something known as mother enmeshment pathology, a form of attachment so intense and distorted that the child cannot form a separate sense of identity. Combined with schizophrenia, isolation, repressed sexuality, and decades of emotional control from Augusta Gein, the result created a delusional break where the boundaries of self disintegrated. Experts concluded that Gein never truly matured emotionally. They described him as a child in a man's body, lost in grief, unable to let go. But none of this brought comfort to families whose loved ones he had exhumed. Plainfield residents struggled with grief of a different kind, the realization that their cemetery had been violated repeatedly for years. Mothers visited graves to check for disturbances. Sons stood at headstones with shovels, prepared to defend what little remained of their ancestors' dignity. Churches held vigils. Funerals were redone. Coffins were reinforced with concrete. The community, small and tightly woven, felt that its most sacred places had been defiled, and no amount of reassurance could erase that. Meanwhile, Ed Gein lived quietly in the Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he spent the remainder of his life. Staff described him as polite, compliant, even helpful. He mowed lawns, read books, and occasionally joked with the nurses. He seemed to exist outside the memory of what he had done, as though those events belonged to a different person. He once told an interviewer that he couldn't remember much of the farmhouse years, saying they felt like a blur or a fog. Whether that was genuine or a product of his illness, no one could say with certainty. On July 26, 1984, at 77 years old, Ed Gein died from complications of lung cancer. His death made headlines across the country, reigniting public fascination with his crimes. Some saw his passing as closure. Others felt nothing had truly closed. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in an unremarkable spot beside his parents and brother. His gravestone was vandalized so often that, in the end, authorities removed it entirely. Today, the plot remains unmarked, an anonymous patch of grass for a man whose name became synonymous with American horror. But the legacy of Ed Gein did not end with his burial. His crimes shaped criminal psychology, inspiring deeper research into the effects of isolation, trauma, and extreme maternal domination. Investigators and therapists used his case to study the early warning signs of severe mental illness and to understand how delusions can warp behavior long before violence erupts. Gein's story also warned law enforcement about the dangers of underestimating the quiet, the isolated, the socially invisible. He had been known for decades as harmless, even helpful. But beneath that mild surface, a storm brewed unnoticed. Society absorbed the lessons in its own unsettling ways. Filmmakers adapted elements of his crimes into iconic horror characters. The skin-wearing Buffalo Bill, the cross-dressing killer from Psycho, the chainsaw-wielding Leatherface. Each one a distorted reflection of the real man. These fictional monsters terrified audiences, but none carried the same quiet dread as the true story. The reminder that real evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it shuffles down a grocery store aisle. Sometimes it babysits your kids. Sometimes it lives in the farmhouse down the road, unnoticed, unseen, slowly unraveling in silence. In the end, the lesson of Ed Gein is not simply about madness or murder. It is about isolation, untreated mental illness, and the human need for connection. It is about the way grief, when left to fester, can twist into something unrecognizable. It is about how communities must look out for one another, not with paranoia, but with compassion, awareness, and vigilance. Because the terrifying truth is this, monsters are rarely born fully formed. They are shaped in the shadows, molded by pain, sharpened by neglect, and revealed only when it is too late. And if Plainfield, Wisconsin taught us anything, it is that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones no one ever notices, until the moment the darkness breaks through.